Traditional and Critical Theory by Max Horkheimer. What is, quote, theory? The question seems a rather easy one for contemporary science. Theory for most researchers is the sum total of propositions about a subject, the propositions being so linked with each other that a few are basic and the rest derive from these. The smaller the number of primary principles in comparison with the derivations, the more perfect the theory. The real validity of the theory depends on the derived propositions being consonant with the actual facts. If experience and theory contradict each other, one of the two must be re-examined. Either the scientist has failed to observe correctly, or something is wrong with the principles of the theory. In relation to facts, therefore, a theory always remains a hypothesis. One must be ready to change that theory if its weakness begins to show as one works through the material. Theory is stored up knowledge, put in a form that makes theory useful for the closest possible description of facts. Poincaré compares science to a library that must ceaselessly expand. Experimental physics is the librarian who takes care of acquisitions, that is, enriches knowledge by supplying new material. Mathematical physics, the theory of natural science in the strictest sense, keeps the catalog. Without the catalog, one would have no access to the library's rich contents. Quote, that is the role of mathematical physics. It must direct generalization so as to increase what I have called just now the output of science. End quote. Henri Poincaré. Henri Poincaré. Science and Hypothesis. The general goal of all theory is a universal systematic science, not limited to any particular subject matter, but embracing all possible objects. The division of sciences is being broken down by deriving the principles for special areas from the same basic premises. The same conceptual apparatus which was elaborated for the analysis of inanimate nature is serving to classify animate nature as well. And anyone who has once mastered the use of it, that is, the rules for derivation, the symbols, the process of comparing derived propositions with observable fact, can use it at any time, but we are still rather far from such an ideal situation. Such, in its broad outlines, is the widely accepted idea of what theory is. Its origins supposedly coincide with the beginnings of modern philosophy. The third maxim in Descartes' scientific method is the decision, quote, to carry on my reflections in due order, commencing with objects that were the most simple and easy to understand, in order to rise little by little or by degrees to knowledge of the most complex, assuming an order, even if a fictitious order, among those which do not follow a natural sequence relative to one another. End quote. Descartes, in the Discourse on Method. The derivation, as usually practiced in mathematics, is to be applied to science. The order in the world is captured by a deductive chain of thought. Those long chains of deductive reasoning, simple and easy as they are, Those long chains of deductive reasoning, simple and easy as they are, of which geometricians make use in order to arrive at the most difficult demonstrations, had caused me to imagine that all those things which fall under the cognizance of men might very likely be mutually related in the same fashion, and that provided only that we abstain from receiving anything as true which is not so, and always retain the order which is necessary in order to deduce the one conclusion from the other, there can be nothing so remote that we cannot reach to it, nor so recondite that we cannot discover it. End quote. Well, sorry, that was a whole quote. the last paragraph. But it's not, the thing I'm reading it from doesn't terribly make a firm distinction between what the block quotes look like and what the original, the new text looks like. So forgive me. I'm not going to reread it though. Just know it was Descartes. Depending on the logician's own philosophical outlook, the most universal propositions from which the deduction begins are themselves regarded as experiential judgments, as inductions as with John Stuart Mill, as evident insights as in rationalist and phenomenological schools, or as arbitrary postulates as in the modern axiomatic approach. In the most advanced logic of the present time, as represented by Husserl's Logische Untersuchungen theory, is defined, quote, as an enclosed system of propositions for a science as a whole, end quote. Husserl. Theory, in the fullest sense, is, quote, a systematically linked set of propositions taking the form of a systematically unified deduction, end quote. Husserl. Science is, quote, a certain totality of propositions emerging in one or other manner from theoretical work, in the systematic order of which propositions a certain totality of objects acquires definition, end quote. Husserl. The basic requirement which any theoretical system must satisfy is that all the parts should intermesh thoroughly and without friction. Harmony, which includes lack of contradictions and the absence of superfluous, purely dogmatic elements which have no influence on the observable phenomenon, are necessary conditions according to Weil. Might be Weil. Hermann Weil, it says in the footnote. Insofar as this traditional conception of theory shows a tendency, it is towards a purely mathematical system of symbols. As elements of the theory, as components of the propositions and conclusions, there are ever fewer names of experiential objects and ever more numerous mathematical symbols. Even the logical operations themselves have already been so rationalized that in large areas of natural science, at least, theory formation has become a matter of mathematical construction. The sciences of man and society have attempted to follow the lead of the natural sciences, with the natural sciences' great successes. The difference between those schools of social science which are more oriented to the investigation of facts and those which concentrate more on principles has nothing directly to do with the concept of theory as such. The assiduous collecting of facts in all the disciplines dealing with social life, the gathering of great masses of detail in connection with problems, the empirical inquiries through careful questionnaires and other means which are a major part of scholarly activity, especially in the Anglo-Saxon universities since Spencer's time. All this adds up to a pattern which is, outwardly, much like the rest of life in society dominated by industrial production techniques. Such an approach seems quite different from the formulation of abstract principles and the analysis of basic concepts by an armchair scholar, which are typical, for example, of one sector of German sociology. Yet these divergences do not signify a structural difference in ways of thinking. In recent periods of contemporary society, the so-called human studies, Geisteswissenschaften, have had but a fluctuating market value and must try to imitate the more prosperous natural sciences, whose practical value is beyond question. There can be no doubt, in fact, that the various schools of sociology have an identical conception of theory, and that it is the same as theory in the natural sciences. Empirically oriented sociologists have the same idea of what a fully elaborated theory should be as their theoretically oriented brethren. The former, indeed, are persuaded that in view of the complexity of social problems and the present state... Oh, I just realized there's a cup of coffee next to my computer. I'll have a swig. Oh. That was a nice little swiglet. Empirically oriented sociologists have the same idea of what a fully elaborated theory should be as their theoretically oriented brethren. The empirically oriented sociologists indeed are persuaded that in view of the complexity of social problems and the present state of science, any concern with general principles must be regarded as indolent and idle. If theoretical work is to be done, theoretical work must be done with an eye unwaveringly on the facts. There can be no thought in the foreseeable future of comprehensive theoretical statements. These scholars are much enamored of the methods of exact formulation, and in particular of mathematical procedures which are especially congenial to the conception of theory described above. What they object to is not so much theory as such, but theories spun out of their heads by men who have no personal experience of the problems of an experimental science. Distinctions like those between community and society, Tönnies, mechanical and organic solidarity, Durkheim, or culture and civilization, A. Weber, as basic forms of human sociality, prove to be of questionable value as soon as one attempts to apply them to concrete problems. The way that sociology must take in the present state of research is, it is argued, the laborious ascent from the description of social phenomenon to detailed comparisons, and only then to the formation of general concepts. The empiricist, true to his traditions, is thus led to say that only complete inductions can supply the primary propositions for a theory, and we are still far from having made such inductions. His opponents claim the right to use other methods less dependent on progress in data collection for the formation of primary categories and insights. Durkheim, for example, agrees with many basic views of the empirical school, but in dealing with principles he opts for an abridgment of the inductive process. It is impossible, Durkheim claims, to classify social happenings on the basis of purely empirical inventories, nor can research make classification easier in the way in which it is expected to do so. Quote, from Emile Durkheim, induction's role is to put into our hands points of reference to which we can refer other observations than the observations which have furnished us with these very points of reference. For this purpose it must be made not from a complete inventory of all the individual characteristics, but from a small number of them carefully chosen. It will spare the observer many steps because it will guide him. We must then choose the most essential characteristics for our classification. End quote. Durkheim, in The Rules of Sociological Method. Whether the primary principles are gotten by selection, by intuition, or by pure stipulation makes no difference, however, to their function in the ideal theoretical system. For the scientist must certainly apply his more or less general propositions as hypotheses to ever new facts. The phenomenologically oriented sociologists will indeed claim that once an essential law has been ascertained, every particular instance will beyond any doubt exemplify the law. But the really hypothetical character of the essential law is manifested as soon as the question arises whether in a particular case we are dealing with an instance of the essence in question or of a related essence, whether we are faced with a poor example of one type or a good example of another type. There is always, on the one hand, the conceptually formulated knowledge, and so, on the other, the facts to be subsumed under it. Such a subsumption or establishing of a relation between simple perception or verification of a fact and the conceptual structure of our knowing is called its theoretical explanation. We need not enter here into the details of the various kinds of classification. It will be enough to indicate briefly how the traditional concept of theory handles the explanation of historical events. The answer emerged clearly in the controversy between Edward Meyer and Max Weber. Meyer regarded as idle and unanswerable the question of whether, even if certain historical personages had not reached certain decisions, the wars they caused would nonetheless sooner or later have occurred. Weber tried to show that if the question were indeed idle and unanswerable, all historical explanation will become impossible. Weber developed a, quote, theory of objective possibility, end quote, based on the theories of the physiologist von Kries and of writers in jurisprudence and national economy, such as Merkel, Liefman, and Radbruch. For Weber, the historian's explanations, like those of the expert in criminal law, rest not on the fullest possible enumeration of all pertinent circumstances, but on the establishment of a connection between those elements of an event which are significant for historical continuity and particular determinative happenings. This connection, for example, the judgment that a war resulted from the policies of a statesman who knew what he was about, logically presupposes that, had such a policy not existed, some other effect would have followed. If one maintains a particular causal nexus between historical events, one is necessarily implying that had the nexus not existed, then in accordance with the rules that govern our experience, another effect would have followed in the given circumstances. The rules of experience here are nothing but the formulations of our knowledge concerning economic, social, and psychological interconnections. With the help of these, we reconstruct the probable course of events, going beyond the event itself to what will serve as explanation. We are thus working with conditional propositions as applied to a given situation. If circumstances A, B, C, and D are given, then event Q must be expected. If D is lacking, event R. If G is added, event S, and so on. This kind of calculation is a logical tool of history, as it is of science. It is in this fashion that theory, in the traditional sense, is actually elaborated. What scientists in various fields regard as the essence of theory thus corresponds, in fact, to the immediate tasks they set for themselves. The manipulation of physical nature and of specific economic and social mechanisms demand alike the amassing of a body of knowledge, such as is supplied in an ordered set of hypotheses. The technological advances of the bourgeois period are inseparably linked to this function of the pursuit of science. On the one hand, it made the facts fruitful for the kind of scientific knowledge that would have practical application in the circumstances. And on the other, it made possible the application of knowledge already possessed. Beyond doubt, such work is a moment in the continuous transformation and development of the material foundations of that society. But the conception of theory was absolutized, as though it were grounded in the inner nature of knowledge as such, or justified in some other ahistorical way, and thus it became a reified ideological category. As a matter of fact, the fruitfulness of newly discovered factual connections for the renewal of existent knowledge and the application of such knowledge to the facts do not derive from purely logical or methodological sources, but can rather be understood only in the context of real social processes. When a discovery occasions the restructuring of current ideas, this is not due exclusively to logical considerations, or more particularly to the contradiction between the discovery and particular elements in current views. If this were the only real issue, one could always think up further hypotheses by which one could avoid changing the theory as a whole. That new views in fact win out is due to concrete historical circumstances, even if the scientist himself may be determined to change his views only by imminent motives. Modern theoreticians of knowledge do not deny the importance of historical circumstance, even if among the most influential non-scientific factors they assign more importance to genius and accident than to social conditions. In the 17th century, for example, men began to resolve the difficulties to which traditional astronomy had fallen, no longer by supplemental instructions, but by adopting the Copernican system in its place. The change was not due to the logical properties alone of the Copernican theory. For example, its greater simplicity. If these properties were seen as advantages, this very fact points beyond itself to the fundamental characteristics of social action at that time. That Copernicanism, hardly mentioned in the 1500s, should now become a revolutionary force, is part of the larger historical process by which mechanistic thinking came to prevail. But the influence of the current social situation on change in scientific structures is not limited to comprehensive theories like the Copernican system. It is also true for special research problems in everyday life. Sheer logic alone will not tell us whether the discovery of new varieties in particular areas of inorganic or organic nature, whether in the chemical laboratory or in the paleontological research, whether in the chemical laboratory or in paleontological research, will be the occasion for modifying old classifications or for elaborating new classifications. The theoreticians of knowledge usually rely here on a concept of theology which only in appearance is immanent to their science. Whether and how new definitions are purposefully drawn up depends in fact not only on the simplicity and consistency of the system, but also, among other things, on the directions and goals of research. These last, however, are not self-explanatory, nor are they, in the last analysis, a matter of insight. As the influence of the subject matter on the theory, so also the application of the theory to the subject matter is not only an intrascientific process, but a social one as well. Bringing hypotheses to bear on facts is an activity that goes on, ultimately not in the savant's head, but in industry. Such rules as the coal-altar under certain conditions becomes colored, or that nitroglycerin, saltpeter, and other materials have great explosive force, are accumulated knowledge which is really applied to reality in the great industrial factories. Among the various philosophical schools, it is the positivist and the pragmatist who apparently pay most attention to the connections between theoretical work and the social life process. These schools consider the provision and usefulness of results to be a scientific task. But in reality, this sense of practical purpose, this belief in the social value of his calling, is a purely private conviction of the scholar. He may just as well believe in an independent, quote, supra-social, end quote, detached knowledge as in the social importance of his expertise. Such opposed interpretations do not influence his real activity in the slightest. The scholar and his science are incorporated into the apparatus of society. The scholar's achievements are a factor in the conservation and continuous renewal of the existing state of affairs, no matter what fine names he gives to what he does. His knowledge and result, it is expected, will correspond to their proper, quote, concept, end quote. That is, they must constitute theory in the sense described above. In the social division of labor, the savant's role is to integrate facts into conceptual frameworks and to keep the conceptual frameworks up to date, so that he himself and all who use them may be masters of the widest possible range of facts. Experiment has the scientific role of establishing facts in such a way that facts fit into theory as currently accepted. The factual material or subject matter is provided from without. Science sees to its formulation in clear and comprehensible terms, so that men may be able to use the knowledge as they wish. The reception, transformation, and rationalization of factual knowledge is the scholar's special form of spontaneity, namely theoretical activity. Whether there is question of as detailed as possible an exposition of a subject as in history and the descriptive branches of other special disciplines, or of the synthesis of masses of data and the attainment of general rules as in physics. The dualism of thought and being, understanding and perception is second nature to the scientist. The traditional idea of theory is based on scientific activity as carried on within the division of labor at a particular stage in the division of labor's development. The traditional idea of theory corresponds to the activity of the scholar, which takes place alongside all the other activities of a society, but in no immediately clear connection with those activities. In this view of theory, therefore, the real social function of science is not made manifest. It speaks not of what theory means in human life, but only of what theory means in the isolated sphere in which for historical reasons that theory comes into existence. Yet as a matter of fact, the life of society is the result of all the work done in the various sectors of production, even if therefore the division of labor in the capitalist system functions but poorly. Its branches, including science, do not become for that reason self-sufficient and independent. They are particular instances of the way in which society comes to grips with nature and maintains its own inherited form. They are particular instances of the way in which society comes to grips with nature and maintains its own inherited form. They are moments in the social process of production, even if they be almost or entirely unproductive in the narrower sense. Neither the structures of industrial and agrarian production, nor the separation of the so-called guiding and executory functions, services and works, or of intellectual and manual operations are eternal or natural state affairs. They emerge rather from the mode of production practiced in particular forms of society. The seeming self-sufficiency enjoyed by work processes whose course is supposedly determined by the very nature of the object corresponds to the seeming freedom of the economic subject in bourgeois society. The economic subjects in bourgeois society believe they are acting according to personal determinations, whereas in fact, even in their most complicated calculations, they but exemplify the working of an incalculable social mechanism. The false consciousness of the bourgeois savant in the liberal era comes to light in very diverse philosophical systems. It found an especially significant expression at the turn of the century in the neo-Kantianism of the Marburg school. Particular traits in the theoretical activity of the specialist are here elevated to the rank of universal categories, of instances of the world mind, the eternal, quote, logos, end quote. More accurately, decisive elements in social life are reduced to the theoretical activity of the savant. Thus, the, quote, power of knowledge, end quote, is called, quote, the power of creative origination, end quote. Quote, production, end quote, means the, quote, creative sovereignty of thought, end quote. For any datum, it must be possible to deduce all its determinations from theoretical systems, and ultimately from mathematics. Thus, all finite magnitudes may be derived from the concept of the infinitely small by way of the infinitesimal calculus. And the process is precisely their, quote, production, end quote. The ideal to be striven for is a unitary system of science which, in the sense just described, will be all-powerful. Since everything about the object is reduced to conceptual determinations, the end result of such theoretical work is that nothing is to be regarded as material and stable. One second. The determinative ordering unifying function is the sole foundation for all else, and towards it all human effort is directed. Production is production of unity. Production is itself the product. Progress in awareness of freedom really means, according to this logic, that the paltry snippet of reality which the savant encounters finds ever more adequate expression in the form of differential quotients. In reality, the scientific calling is only one, non-independent element in the work of historical activity of man, but in such a philosophy the former replaces the latter. To the extent that it conceives of reason as actually determining the course of events in a future society, such a hypostatization of logos, as reality, is also a camouflaged utopia. In fact, however, the self-knowledge of present-day man is not a mathematical knowledge of nature, which claims to be the eternal logos, but a critical theory of society as society is, a theory dominated at every turn by a concern for reasonable conditions of life. The isolated consideration of particular activities and branches of activity, along with their contents and objects, requires for its validity an unaccompanying concrete awareness of its own limitations. A conception is needed which overcomes the one-sidedness that necessarily arises when limited intellectual processes are detached from their matrix in the total activity of society. In the idea of theory which the scholar inevitably reaches when working purely within his own discipline, the relation between fact and conceptual ordering of fact offers a point of departure for such a corrective conception. The prevailing theory of knowledge has, of course, recognized the problem which this relation raises. The point is constantly stressed that identical objects provide for one discipline problems to be resolved only in some distant future, while in another discipline they are accepted as simple facts. Connections which provide physics with research problems are taken for granted in biology. Within biology, physiological processes raise problems while psychological processes do not. The social sciences take human and non-human nature in its entirety as given, and are concerned only with how relationships are established between man and nature and between man and man. However, an awareness of this relativity immanent in bourgeois society, in the relationship between theoretical thought and facts, is not enough to bring the concept of theory to a new stage of development. What is needed is a radical reconsideration not of the scientist alone, but of the knowing individual as such. The whole perceptible world is present to a number the whole perceptible world as present to a member of bourgeois society, and as interpreted within a traditional worldview which is in continuous interaction with that given world, is seen by the perceiver as a sum total of facts. It is there and must be accepted. The classificatory thinking of each individual is one of those social reactions by which men try to adapt to reality in a way that best meets their needs. But there is at this point an essential difference between the individual and society. The world which is given to the individual, and which the individual must accept and take into account, is, in its present and continuing form, a product of the activity of society as a whole. The objects we perceive in our surroundings, cities, villages, fields, and woods, bear the mark of having been worked on by man. It is not only in clothing and appearance, in outward form and emotional makeup, that men are the product of history. Even the way they see and hear is inseparable from the social life process as it has evolved over the millennium. The facts which our senses present to us are socially preformed in two ways: through the historical character of the object perceived, and through the historical character of the perceiving organ. Both are not simply natural, they are shaped by human activity, and yet the individual perceives himself as receptive and passive in the act of perception. The opposition of passivity and activity, which appears in knowledge theory as a dualism of sense perception and understanding, does not hold for society, however, in the same measure as for the individual. The individual sees himself as passive and dependent, but society, though made up of individuals, is an active subject, even if a non-conscious subject, and to that extent a subject only in an improper sense. This difference in the existence of man and society is an expression of the cleavage which has up to now affected the historical forms of social life. The existence of society has either been founded directly on oppression or between the blind outcome of conflicting forces, but in any event not the result of conscious spontaneity on the part of free individuals. Therefore, the meaning of, quote, activity and, quote, passivity changes accordingly. Therefore, the meaning of, quote, activity and, quote, passivity changes according as these concepts are applied to society or to individual. In the bourgeois economic mode, the activity of society is blind and concrete, that of individuals abstract and conscious. Human production also always has an element of planning to it. To the extent, then, that the facts which the individual and his theory encounter are socially produced, there must be rationality in them, even if in a restricted sense. But social action always involves, in addition, available knowledge and its application. The perceived fact is therefore co-determined by human ideas and concepts, even before its conscious theoretical elaboration by the knowing individual. Nor are we to think here only of experiments in natural science. The so-called purity of objective event to be achieved by the experimental procedure is, of course, obviously connected with technological conditions, and the connections of these in turn with the material process of production is evident. But it is easy here to confuse two questions: the question of the mediation of the factual through the activity of society as a whole, and the question of the influence of the measuring instrument, that is, of a particular action upon the object being observed. The latter problem, which continually plagues physics, is no more closely connected with the problem that concerns us here than is the problem of perception generally, including perception in everyday life. Man's physiological apparatus for sensation itself largely anticipates the order followed in physical experiment. As man reflectively records reality, he separates and rejoins pieces of reality, and concentrates on some particulars while failing to notice other particulars. This process is just as much a result of the modern mode of production as the perception of a man in a tribe of primitive hunters and fishers is the result of the conditions of his existence, as well, of course, as of the object of perception. In this context, the proposition that tools are prolongations of human organs can be inverted to state that the organs are also prolongations of the tools. In the higher stages of civilization, conscious human action unconsciously determines not only the subjective side of perception, but in larger degree the object as well. The sensible world, which a member of industrial society sees about him every day, bears the marks of deliberate work. Tenement houses, factories, cotton, cattle for slaughter, men, and in addition, not only objects such as subway trains, delivery trucks, autos, and airplanes, but the movements in the course of which they are perceived. The distinction within this complex totality between what belongs to unconscious nature and what is the action of man in society cannot be drawn in concrete detail, even where there is question of experiencing natural objects as such. The object's very naturalness is determined by contrast with the social world, and to that extent depends upon the social world. The individual, however, receives sensible reality as a simple sequence of facts into his world of ordered concepts. The latter, too, though their context changes, have developed along with the life process of society. Thus, though the ordering of reality by understanding and the passing of judgment on objects usually take place as a foregone conclusion and with surprising unanimity among members of a given society, yet the harmony between perception and traditional thought and among the monads or individual subjects of knowledge is not a metaphysical accident. The power of healthy human understanding or common sense, for which there are no mysteries, as well as the general acceptance of identical views in areas not directly connected with class conflicts, as for example in the natural sciences, are conditioned by the fact that the world of objects to be judged is in large measure produced by an activity that is itself determined by the very ideas which help the individual to recognize that world and to grasp that world conceptually. In Kant's philosophy, this state of affairs is expressed in idealist form. The doctrine of purely passive sensation and active understanding suggests to Kant the question of whence the understanding derives the understanding's assured expectation that the manifold given in sensation will always obey the rules of understanding. Kant explicitly rejects the thesis of a pre-established harmony, quote, a kind of pre-formation system of pure reason, end quote, in which reason has innate and sure rules with which objects are in accord. His own explanation is that sensible appearances are already formed by the transcendental subject, that is, through the activity of reason, when they are received by perception and consciously judged. In the most important chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant tried to give a more detailed explanation of the, quote, transcendental affinity, end quote, or subjective determination of sensible material, a process of which the individual is unaware. The difficulty and obscurity which, by Kant's own admission, marked the sections on the deduction and schematism of the pure concepts of understanding may be connected with the fact that Kant imagines the supra-individual activity of which the individual is unaware only in the idealist form of a consciousness in itself, that is, a purely intellectual source. In accordance with the theoretical vision available in his day, he does not see reality as product of a society's work which taken as a whole is chaotic, but at the individual level is purposeful. Where Hegel glimpses the cunning of a reason that is nonetheless world historical and objective, Kant sees, quote, an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover, and to have open to our gaze, end quote. At least Kant understood that behind the discrepancy between fact and theory which the scholar experiences in his professional work, there lies a deeper unity, namely the general subjectivity upon which individual knowledge depends. The activity of society thus appears to be a transcendental power, that is, the sum total of spiritual factors. However, Kant's claim that its reality is sunk in obscurity, that is, that it is irrational despite all its rationality, is not without its kernel of truth. The bourgeois type of economy, despite all the ingenuity of the competing individuals within it, is not governed by any plan. It is not consciously directed to a general goal. The life of society as a whole proceeds from this economy only at the cost of excessive friction, in a stunted form, and almost, as it were, accidentally. The internal difficulties in the supreme concepts of Kantian philosophy, especially the ego of transcendental subjectivity, pure or original apperception, and the consciousness in itself, show the depth and honesty of Kant's thinking. The two-sidedness of these Kantian concepts, that is, their supreme unity and purposefulness, on the one hand, and their obscurity, unknownness, and impenetrability on the other, reflects exactly the contradiction-filled form of human activity in the modern period. The collaboration of men in society is the mode of existence which reason urges upon them, and so they do apply their powers and thus confirm their own rationality. But at the same time, their work and its results are alienated from them, and the whole process, with all its waste of work power and human life, and with its wars and all its senseless wretchedness, seems to be an unchangeable force of nature, a fate beyond man's control. In Kant's theoretical philosophy, in his analysis of knowledge, this contradiction is preserved. The unresolved problem of the relation between activity and passivity, a priori and sense data, philosophy and psychology, is therefore not due to purely subjective insufficiency, but is objectively necessary. Hegel discovered and developed these contradictions, but finally resolved those contradictions in a higher intellectual realm. Kant claimed that there existed a universal subject, which, however, he could not quite describe. Hegel escaped this embarrassment by postulating the absolute spirit as the most real thing of all. According to him, the universal has already adequately evolved itself and is identical with all that happens. Reason need no longer stand over against itself in purely critical fashion. In Hegel, reason has become affirmative even before reality itself is affirmed as rational. But, confronted with the persisting contradictions in human existence, and with the impotence of individuals in face of situations they have themselves brought about, the Hegelian solution seems a purely private assertion, a personal peace treaty between the philosopher and an inhuman world. The integration of facts into existing conceptual schemes, and the revision of facts through simplification or elimination of contradictions are, as we have indicated, part of general social activity. Since society is divided into groups and classes, it is understandable that theoretical structures should be related to the general activity of society in different ways, according as the authors of such structures belong to one or other social class. Thus, when the bourgeois class was first coming into being in a feudal society, the purely scientific theory which arose with the bourgeois class tended chiefly to break up the status quo and attacked the old form of society. Under liberalism, this theory was accepted by the prevailing human type. Today, development is determined much less by average men who compete with each other in improving the material apparatus of production and its products, than by conflicting national and international cliques of leaders at the various levels of command in the economy and the state. Insofar as theoretical thought is not related to highly specialized purposes connected with these conflicts, especially war and the industry that supports war, interest in theory has waned. Less energy is being expended on forming and developing the capacity of thought without regard to how it is to be applied. These distinctions, to which others might be added, do not at all change the fact that a positive social function is exercised by theory in its traditional form. That is, the critical examination of data with the aid of an inherited apparatus of concepts and judgments which is still operative in even the simplest minds, as well as the interaction between facts and theoretical forms that goes on in daily professional activity. In this intellectual work, the needs and goals, the experiences and skills, the customs and tendencies of the contemporary form of human existence have all played their part. Like a material tool of production, it represents potentially an element not only of the contemporary cultural totality, but of a more just, more differentiated, more harmoniously organized one as well. To the extent that this theoretical thinking does not deliberately lend itself to concerns which are external and alien to the object, but truly concentrates on the problems which it meets in the wake of technical development, and in this connection itself turns up new problems and transforms old concepts where necessary. To this extent, it may rightly regard the technological and industrial accomplishments of the bourgeois era as its own justification and be confident of its own value. This kind of theoretical thinking considers itself to belong to the realm of the hypothetical, of course, not of certainty, but the hypothetical character is compensated for in many ways. The uncertainty involved is no greater than it need be, given the intellectual and technological means at hand at any given time with their proven general usefulness. The very elaboration of such hypotheses, however small their probability may be, it is itself a socially necessary and valuable accomplishment which is not at all hypothetical. The construction of hypotheses and theoretical activity in general are a kind of work which in present social circumstances has a real usefulness, that is, there is a demand for it. Insofar as it is underpaid or even neglected, it only shares the fate of other concrete and possibly useful kinds of work which have gotten lost in the present economy. Yet these very kinds of work presuppose the present economy and are part of the total economic process as it exists under specific historical conditions. This has nothing to do with the question of whether scientific labor is itself productive in the narrow sense of the term. In the present order of things, there is a demand for an immense number of so-called scientific creations. They are honored in very varying ways, and part of the goods emerging from strictly productive work is handed over for them without anything at all being thereby settled about their own productivity. Even the emptiness of certain areas of university activity, as well as the idle ingenuity and the construction of metaphysical and non-metaphysical ideologies, have their social significance no less than do other needs arising out of social conflict. However, they do not therefore further the interest of any important large sector of society in the present age. An activity which in its existing form contributes to the being of society need not be productive at all, that is, be a money-making enterprise. Nevertheless, it can belong to the existing order and help make the existing order possible, as is certainly the case with specialized science. We must go on now to add that there is a human activity which has society itself for its object. Footnote. In the following pages, this activity is called, quote, critical, end quote, activity. The term is used here less in the sense it has in the idealist critique of pure reason than in the sense it has in the dialectical critique of political economy. It points to an essential aspect of the dialectical theory of society. End footnote. The aim of this activity is not simply to eliminate one or other abuse, for it regards such abuses as necessarily connected with the way in which the social structure is organized. Although it itself emerges from the social structure, its purpose is not, either in its conscious intention or in its objective significance, the better functioning of any element in the structure. On the contrary, it is suspicious of the very categories of better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable, as these are understood in the present order, and refuse to take them as non-scientific presuppositions about which one can do nothing. The individual, as a rule, must simply accept the basic conditions of his existence as given and strive to fulfill those basic conditions of his existence. He finds his satisfaction and praise in accomplishing as well as he can the task connected with his place in society, and in courageously doing his duty despite all the sharp criticism he may choose to exercise in particular matters. But the critical attitude of which we are speaking is wholly distrustful of the rules of conduct with which society, as presently constituted, provides each of its members. The separation between individual and society, in virtue of which the individual accepts as natural the limits prescribed for his activity, is revitalized in critical theory. The latter considers the overall framework which is conditioned by the blind interaction of individual activities, that is, the existent division of labor and the class distinctions, to be a function which originates in human action, and therefore is a possible object of planful decision and rational determination of goals. The two-sided character of the social totality in its present form becomes, for men who adopt the critical attitude, a conscious opposition. In recognizing the present form of economy, and the whole culture which it generates to be the product of human work, as well as the organization which mankind was capable of, has provided for itself in the present era, these men identify themselves with this totality and conceive it as will and reason. It is their own world. At the same time, however, they experience the fact that society is comparable to non-human natural processes, to pure mechanisms, because cultural forms which are supported by war and oppression are not the creations of a unified, self-conscious will. That world is not their own, but the world of capital. Previous history thus cannot really be understood. Only the individuals and specific groups in it are intelligible. And even these not totally. since their internal dependence on an inhuman society means that even in their conscious actions, such individuals and groups are still in good measure mechanical functions. The identification, then, of men of critical mind with their society is marked by tension, and the tension characterizes all the concepts of the critical way of thinking. Thus, such thinkers interpret the economic categories of work, value, and productivity exactly as they are interpreted in the existing order, and they regard any other interpretation as pure idealism. But at the same time, they consider it rank dishonesty simply to accept the interpretation. The critical acceptance of the categories which rule social life contains simultaneously their condemnation. This dialectical character of the self-interpretation of contemporary man is what, in the last analysis, also causes the obscurity of the Kantian critique of reason. Reason cannot become transparent to itself as long as men act as members of an organism which lacks reason. Organism as a naturally developing and declining unity cannot be a sort of model for society, but only a form of deadened existence from which society must emancipate itself. An attitude which aims at such an emancipation and at the alteration of society as a whole might well be of service in theoretical work carried on within reality as presently ordered, but it lacks the pragmatic character which attaches to traditional thought as a socially useful professional activity. In traditional theoretical thinking, the genesis of particular objective facts, the practical application of the conceptual systems by which it grasps the facts, and the role of such systems in action are all taken to be external to the theoretical thinking itself. This alienation, which finds expression in philosophical terminology as the separation of value and research, knowledge and action, and other polarities, protects the savant from the tensions we have indicated and provides an assured framework for his activity. Yet a kind of thinking which does not accept this framework seems to have the ground taken out from under it. If a theoretical procedure does not take the form of determining objective facts, with the help of the simplest and most differentiated conceptual systems available, what can it be but an aimless intellectual game, half conceptual poetry, half impotent expression of states of mind? The investigation into the social conditions of facts and theories may indeed be a research problem, perhaps even a whole field for theoretical work. But how can such studies be radically different from other specialized efforts? Research into ideologies or sociology of knowledge, which has been taken over from the critical theory of society and established as a specific discipline, is not opposed either in its aim or in its other ambitions to the usual activities that go on within classificatory science. In this reaction to critical theory, the self-awareness of thought as such is reduced to the discovery of the relationship that exists between intellectual positions and their social location. Yet the structure of the critical attitude, inasmuch as its intentions go beyond prevailing social ways of acting, is no more closely related to social disciplines thus conceived than it is to natural science. Its opposition to the traditional concept of theory springs in general from a difference not so much of objects as of subjects. For men of the critical mind, the facts, as they emerge from the work of society, are not extrinsic in the same degree as they are for the savants or for members of other professions who all think like little savants. The latter look towards a new kind of organization of work, but in so far as the objective realities given in perception are conceived as products which in principle should be under human control, and in the future at least will in fact come under it, these realities lose the character of pure factuality. The scholarly specialist, quote, as, end quote, scientist regards social reality and its products as extrinsic to him, end quote, as, end quote, citizen, exercises his interest in them through political articles, membership in political parties or social service organizations, and participation in elections. But he does not unify these two activities and his other activities as well, except at best by psychological interpretation. Critical thinking, on the contrary, is motivated today by the effort really to transcend the tension and to abolish the opposition between the individual's purposefulness, spontaneity, and rationality, and those work process relationships on which society is built. Critical thought has a concept of man as in conflict with himself until his opposition is removed. If activity governed by reason is proper to man, then existent social practices, which forms the individual's life down to its last details, is inhuman, and this inhumanity affects everything that goes on in the society. There will always be something that is extrinsic to man's intellectual and material activity, namely nature as the totality of as yet unmastered elements with which society must deal. But when situations which really depend on man alone, the relationships of men in their work, and the course of man's own history are also accounted part of, quote, nature, end quote, the resultant extrinsicality is not only not a supra-historical eternal category. Even pure nature in the sense described is not that, but it is a sign of contemptible weakness. To surrender to such weakness is non-human and irrational. Bourgeois thought is so constituted that in reflection on the subject, which exercises such thought, a logical necessity forces it to recognize an ego which imagines itself to be autonomous. Bourgeois thought is essentially abstract, and its principle is an individuality, which inflatedly believes itself to be the ground of the world, or even to be the world without qualification, an individuality separated off from events. The direct contrary of such an outlook is the attitude which holds the individual to be the unproblematic expression of an already constituted society. An example would be a nationalist ideology. Here the rhetorical quote, "we," end quote, is taken seriously. Speech is accepted as the organ of the community. In the internally rent society of our day, such thinking, except in social questions, sees non-existent unanimities and is illusory. Critical thought and its theory are opposed to both the types of thinking just described. Critical thinking is the function neither of the isolated individual nor of a sum total of individuals. Critical thinking's subject is rather a definite individual in his real relation to other individuals and groups, in his conflict with a particular class, and finally in the resultant web of relationships with the social totality and with nature. The subject is no mathematical point like the ego of bourgeois philosophy. His activity is the construction of the social present. Furthermore, the thinking subject is not the place where knowledge and object coincide, nor consequently the starting point for attaining absolute knowledge. Such an illusion about the thinking subject, under which idealism has lived since Descartes, is ideology in the strict sense, for in it the limited freedom of the bourgeois individual puts on the illusory form of perfect freedom and autonomy. As a matter of fact, however, in a society which is untransparent and without self-awareness, the ego, whether active simply as thinker or active in other ways as well, is unsure of itself too. In reflection on man, subject and object are surrendered. Their identity lies in the future, not in the present. The method leading to such an identification may be called explanation in Cartesian language, but in genuinely critical thought, explanation signifies not only a logical process, but a concrete historical process as well. In the course of it, both the social structure as a whole and the relation of the theoretician to society are altered. That is, both the subject and the role of thought are changed. The acceptance of an essential unchangeableness between subject theory and object thus distinguishes the Cartesian conception from every kind of dialectical logic. How is critical thought related to experience? One might maintain that if such thought were not simply to classify, but also to determine for itself the goals which classification serves, in other words, its own fundamental direction, it would remain locked up within itself, as happened to idealist philosophy. If it did not take refuge in utopian fantasy, it would be reduced to the formalistic fighting of sham battles. The attempt legitimately to determine practical goals by thinking must always fail. If thought were not content with the role given to thought in existent society, if thought were not to engage in theory in the traditional sense of the word, thought would necessarily have to return to illusions long since laid bare. The fault in such reflections as these on the role of thought is that thinking is understood in a detachedly departmentalized and therefore spiritualist way, as it is today under existing conditions of the division of labor. In society as it is, the power of thought has never controlled itself, but has always functioned as a non-independent moment in the work process, and the latter has its own orientation and tendency. The work process enhances and develops human life through the conflicting movement of progressive and retrogressive periods. In the historical form in which society has existed, however, the full measure of goods produced for man's enjoyment has, at any particular stage, been given directly only to a small group of men. Such a state of affairs has found expression in thought, too, and left its mark on philosophy and religion. But from the beginning, the desire to bring the same enjoyment to the majority has stirred in the depths of men's hearts. Despite all the material appropriateness of class organization, each of its forms has finally proved inadequate. Slaves, vassals, and citizens have cast off their yoke. This desire, too, has found expression in cultural creations. Now, inasmuch as every individual in modern times has been required to make his own the purposes of society as a whole, and to recognize these in society, there is the possibility that men would become aware of and concentrate their attention upon the path which the social work process has taken, without any definite theory behind it, as a result of disparate forces interacting, and with the despair of the masses acting as a decisive factor at major turning points. Thought does not spin such a possibility out of itself, but rather becomes aware of thought's own proper function. In the course of history, men have come to know their own activity, and thus to recognize the contradiction that marks their existence. The bourgeois economy was concerned that the individual should maintain the life of society by taking care of his own personal happiness. Such an economy has within it, however, a dynamism which results in a fantastic degree of power for some, such as reminds us of the old Asiatic dynasties, and in material and intellectual weaknesses for many others. The original fruitfulness of the bourgeois organization of the life process, is thus transformed into a paralyzing barrenness, and men by their own toil keep in existence a reality which enslaves men in ever greater degree. Yet, as far as the role of experience is concerned, there is a difference between traditional and critical theory. The viewpoints which critical theory derives from historical analysis as the goals of human activity, especially the idea of a reasonable organization of society that will meet the needs of the whole community, are immanent in human work but are not correctly grasped by individuals or by the common mind. A certain concern is also required if these tendencies are to be perceived and expressed. According to Marx and Engels, such a concern is necessarily generated in the proletariat because of its situation in modern society. The proletariat experiences the connection between work which puts ever more powerful instruments into men's hands in their struggle with nature, and the continuous renewal of an outmoded social organization. Unemployment, economic crises, militarization, terrorist regimes, in a word, the whole condition of the masses, are not due, for example, to limited technological possibilities, as might have been the case in earlier periods, but to the circumstances of production which are no longer suitable to our time. The application of all intellectual and physical means for the mastery of nature is hindered because in the prevailing circumstances these means are entrusted to special mutually opposed interests. Production is not geared to life of the whole community while heeding also the claims of the individuals. It is geared to the power-backed claims of individuals while being concerned hardly at all with the life of the community. This is the principal result in the present property system of the principle that it is enough for individuals to look out for themselves. But it must be added that even the situation of the proletariat is in this society no guarantee of correct knowledge. The proletariat may indeed have experience of meaninglessness in the form of continuing and increasing wretchedness and injustice in the proletariat's own life. Yet this awareness is prevented from becoming a social force by the differentiation of social structure, which is still imposed on the proletariat from above, and by the opposition between personal class interest, which is transcended only at very special moments. Even to the proletariat, the world superficially seems quite different than it really is. Even an outlook which could grasp that no opposition really exists between the proletariat's own true interest and those of society as a whole, and would therefore derive its principles of action from thoughts and feelings of the masses, would fall into slavish dependence on the status quo. The intellectual is satisfied to proclaim with reverent admiration the creative strength of the proletariat and finds satisfaction in adapting himself to the proletariat and canonizing it. The intellectual fails to see that such an invasion of theoretical effort, which the passivity of his own thinking spares him, and of temporary opposition to the masses, which active theoretical effort on his part might force upon him, only makes the masses blinder and weaker than they need be. His own thinking should in fact be a critical, promotive factor in the development of the masses. When he wholly accepts the present psychological state of that class, which objectively considered embodies the power to change society, he has the happy feeling of being linked with an immense force and enjoys a professional optimism. When the optimism is shattered in periods of crushing defeat, many intellectuals risk falling into a pessimism about society and a nihilism which are just as ungrounded as their exaggerated optimism had been. They cannot bear the thought that the kind of thinking which is most topical, which has the deepest grasp of the historical situation, and is most pregnant with the future, must at certain times isolate its subject and throw him back upon himself. If critical theory consisted essentially in formulations of the feelings and ideas of one class at any given moment, it would not be structurally different from the special branches of science. It would be engaged in describing the psychological contents typical of certain social groups. It would be social psychology. The relation of being to consciousness is different in different classes of society. If we take seriously the ideas by which the bourgeoisie explains its own order, free exchange, free competition, harmony of interest, and so on, and if we follow them to their logical conclusion, they manifest their inner contradiction and therewith their real opposition to the bourgeois order. The simple description of bourgeois self-awareness thus does not give us the truth about this class of men. Similarly, a systematic presentation of the contents of proletarian consciousness cannot provide a true picture of proletarian existence and interests. It would yield only an application of traditional theory to a specific problem, and not the intellectual side of the history process of proletarian emancipation. The same would be true if one were to limit oneself to appraising and making known the ideas not of the proletariat in general, but of some more advanced sector of the proletariat, for example, a party or its leadership. The real task set here would be the registering and classifying of facts with the help of the most suitable conceptual apparatus, and the theoretician's ultimate goal would be the prediction of future socio-psychological phenomenon. Thought and the formation of theory would be one thing, and its object, the proletariat, another. If, however, the theoretician and his specific object are seen as forming a dynamic unity with the oppressed class, so that his presentation of societal contradictions is not merely an expression of the concrete historical situation, but also a force within it to stimulate change, then his real function emerges. The course of the conflict between the advanced sectors of the class and the individuals who speak out the truth concerning it, as well as of the conflict between the most advanced sectors with their theoreticians and the rest of the class, is to be understood as a process of interactions in which awareness comes to flower along with awareness's liberating but also its aggressive forces, which incite while also requiring discipline. The sharpness of the conflict shows in the ever-present possibility of tension between the theoretician and the class which the theoretician's thinking is to serve. The unity of the social forces which promise liberation is at the same time their distinction in Hegel's sense. It exists only as a conflict which continually threatens the subjects caught up in it. This truth becomes clearly evident in the person of the theoretician. He exercises an aggressive critique not only against the conscious defenders of the status quo, but also against the distracting conformist or utopian tendencies within his own household. The traditional type of theory, one side of which finds expression in formal logic, is in its present form part of the production process with its division of labor. Since society must come to grips with nature in future ages as well, this intellectual technology will not become irrelevant, but on the contrary is to be developed as fully as possible. But the kind of theory which is an element in action leading to new social forms is not a cog in an already existent mechanism. Even if victory or defeat provides a vague analogy to the confirmation of her failure of scientific hypotheses, the theoretician who sets himself up in opposition to society as it does not have the consolidation that such hypotheses are part of his professional work. He cannot sing for himself the hymn of praise which Poincaré sang to the enrichment deriving even from hypotheses that must be rejected. His profession is the struggle of which his own thinking is a part, and not something self-sufficient and separable from the struggle. Of course, many elements of theory in the usual sense enter into his work. The knowledge and prognosis of relatively isolated facts, scientific judgments, the elaboration of problems which differ from those of other theoreticians because of his specific interests, but nonetheless manifest the same logical form. Traditional theory may take a number of things for granted, its positive role in a functioning society, an admittedly indirect and obscure relation to the satisfaction of general needs, and participation in the self-renewing life process. But all these exigencies about which science need not trouble itself because their fulfillment is rewarded and confirmed by the social position of the scientists are called into question in critical thought. The goal at which the latter aims, namely the rational state of society, is forced upon him by present distress. The theory which projects such a solution to the distress does not labor in the service of an existing reality, but only gives voice to the mystery of that reality. However cogently absurdities and errors may be uncovered at any given moment, however much every error may be shown to be taking its revenge, yet the overall tendency of the critical theoretical undertaking receives no sanction from so-called healthy human understanding. It has no custom on its side, even when it promises success. Theories, on the contrary, which are confirmed or disproved in the building of machines, military organizations, even successful motion pictures, look to a clearly distinguishable consumer group, even when, like theoretical physics, they are pursued independently of any application or consist only in a joyous and virtuous playing with mathematical symbols. Society proves its humaneness by rewarding such activity. But there are no such examples of the form consumption will take in the future with which critical thinking is concerned. Nonetheless, the idea of a future society as a community of free men, which is possible through technical means already at hand, does have a content, and to it there must be fidelity amid all change. In the form of an insight that the dismemberment and irrationality of society can now be eliminated, and how this is to be accomplished, this idea is constantly being renewed amid prevailing conditions. But the state of affairs upon which judgment is passed in this conception, and the tendencies inciting men to build a rational society, are not brought into existence outside thought. But the state of affairs upon which judgment is passed in this conception, and the tendencies inciting men to build a rational society, are not brought into existence outside thought by forces extrinsic to it. With thought, then, as it were, accidentally recognizing its own reflection in the product of these forces. Rather, one and the same subject who wants a new state of affairs, a better reality to come to pass, also brings it forth. Out of the obscure harmony between being and thought, understanding and sense perception, human needs and their satisfaction in today's economy, a harmony which seems an accident to the bourgeois eye, there will emerge in the future age the relation between rational intention and its realization. The struggle for the future provides but a fragmentary reflection of this relation, to the extent that a will which aims at the shaping of society as a whole is already consciously operative in the construction of the theory and practice which will lead to it. Despite all the discipline justified by the need to win through, the community of those engaged in the struggle experiences something of the freedom and spontaneity which will mark the future. Where the unity of discipline and freedom has disappeared, the movement becomes a matter of interest only to its own bureaucracy, a play that already belongs to the repertory of modern history. That the future being striven for should be of a vital reality, even in the present, proves nothing, however. The conceptual systems of classificatory understanding, the categories into which dead and living things, social, psychological, and physical phenomenon have all been absorbed together, the division of objects and of judgments on them into the various pigeonholes of the special areas of knowledge, all this makes up the apparatus of thought as it has proved and refined itself in connection with the real work process. The world of concepts makes up the consciousness of most men, and it has a basis to which its proponents can appeal. The concerns of critical thought, too, are those of most men, but they are not recognized to be such. The concepts which emerge under its influence are critical of the present. The Marxist categories of class, exploitation, surplus value, profit, pauperization, and breakdown are elements in a conceptual whole, and the meaning of this whole is to be sought not in the preservation of contemporary society, but in contemporary society's transformation into the right kind of society. Consequently, although critical theory at no point proceeds arbitrarily and in chance fashion, It appears to prevailing modes of thought to be subjective and speculative, one-sided and useless, since it runs counter to prevailing habits of thought which contribute to the persistence of the past and carry on the business of an outdated order of things, both past and outdated order guaranteeing a faction-ridden world. It appears to be biased and unjust. Above all, however, critical theory has no material accomplishment to show for itself. The change which critical theory seeks to bring about is not effected gradually, so that success, even if slow, might be steady. The growth in numbers of more or less clear-minded disciples, the influence of some among them on governments, the power position of parties which have a positive attitude towards this theory, or at least do not outlaw this theory, all these are among the vicissitudes encountered in the struggle for a higher stage of man's life in community, and are not found at the beginnings of the struggle. Such success as these may even prove later on to have been only apparent victories and really blunders. Again, fertilization in agriculture, for example, or the application of medical therapy may be far removed from ideal reality and yet accomplish something. Perhaps the theories underlying such technology may have to be refined, revised, or abolished in connection with specialized activity and with discoveries in other areas. Through such techniques, nonetheless, a certain amount of labor is saved in achieving results, and many an illness is healed or alleviated. But the first consequence of the theory which urges a transformation of society as a whole is only an intensification of the struggle with which the theory is connected. Furthermore, although material improvements originating in the increased powers of resistance of certain groups are indirectly due to the critical theory, the groups in question are not sectors of society whose steady spread would finally bring the new society to pass. Such ideas mistake the fundamental difference between a fragmented society in which material and ideological power operates to maintain privileges and an association of free men in which each has the same possibility of self-development. Such an association is not an abstract utopia, for the possibility in question can be shown to be real even at the present stage of productive forces. But how many tendencies will actually lead to this association? How many transitional phases have been reached? How desirable and intrinsically valuable individual preliminary stages may be, and what their historical importance is in relation to the idea, all this will be made clear only when the idea is brought to realization. One thing which this way of thinking has in common with fantasy is that an image of the future which springs indeed from a deep understanding of the present determines men's thoughts and actions even in periods when the course of events seems to be leading far away from such a future and seems to justify every reaction except belief in fulfillment. It is not the arbitrariness and supposed independence of fantasy that is the common bond here, but its obstinacy. Within the most advanced group, it is the theoretician who must have this obstinacy. The theoretician of the ruling class, perhaps after difficult beginnings, may reach a relatively assured position, but on the other hand, the theoretician is also at times an enemy and a criminal, at times a solitary utopian. Even after his death, the question of what he really was is not decided. The historical significance of his work is not self-evident. It rather depends on men speaking and acting in such a way as to justify it. It is not a finished and fixed historical creation. The capacity for such acts of thought as are required in everyday action, social or scientific, has been developed in men by a realistic training over many centuries. Failure here leads to affliction, failure, and punishment. The intellectual modality to which we refer consists essentially in this, that the conditions for the bringing about of an effect which has always appeared in the same circumstances before are known and in the appropriate context are supplied. There is an object lesson kind of instruction through good and bad experiences and through organized experiment. The issue here is direct involve direct individual self-preservation, and in bourgeois society men have the opportunity of developing a sense of this. Knowledge in this traditional sense, including every type of experience, is preserved in critical theory and practice. But in regard to the essential kind of change at which the critical theory aims, there can be no corresponding concrete perception of it until it actually comes about. If the proof of the pudding is in the eating here is still in the future. Comparison with similar historical events can be drawn only in a limited degree. Constructive thinking, then, plays a more important role than empirical verification in this theory as a whole, in comparison with what goes on in the activity of common sense. This is one of the reasons why men who in particular scientific areas or in other professional activity are able to do extremely competent work can show themselves quite limited and incompetent despite goodwill when it comes to questions concerning society as a whole. In all past periods when social change was on the agenda, people who thought, quote, too much, end quote, were regarded as dangerous. This brings us to the problem of the general relation of the intelligentsia to society. The theoreticians whose business it is to hasten developments which will lead to a society without injustice can find himself in opposition to views prevailing even among the proletariat, as we said above. If such a conflict were not possible, there would be no need of a theory. Those who need it would come upon it without help. The conflict does not necessarily have anything to do with the class to which the theoretician belongs, nor does it depend on the kind of income he has. Engels was a businessman. In professional sociology, which derives its concept of class not from a critique of the economy, but from its own observations, the theoretician's social position is determined neither by the source of his income, nor by the concrete content of his theory, but by the formal element of education. The possibility of a wider vision, not the kind possessed by industrial magnates who know the world market and direct whole states from behind the scenes, but the kind possessed by university professors, middle-level civil servants, doctors, lawyers, and so forth, is what constitutes the, quote, intelligentsia, end quote. That is, a special social or even super-social stratum. It is the task of the critical theoretician to reduce the tension between his own insight and oppressed humanity in whose service he thinks. But in the sociological concept of which we speak, detachment from all classes is an essential mark of the intelligentsia, a sort of sign of superiority of which it is proud. Such a neutral category corresponds to the abstract self-awareness typical of the savant. To the bourgeois consumer under liberalism, knowledge meant knowledge that was useful in some circumstances or other, no matter what kind of knowledge might be in question. The sociology we speak of approaches knowledge in the same way at the theoretical level. Marx and Mises, Lenin and Liefman, Jaurès and Jevons all come under the same sociological heading unless the politicians are left out of the list and put down as potential students of the political scientists, sociologists, and philosophers, who are the real men of knowledge. From them, the politician is to learn to use, quote, such and such a means, end quote, when he takes, quote, such and such a stand, end quote. He must learn whether the practical position he adopts can be implemented with logical consistency. A division of labor is established between men who in social conflicts affect the course of history and the social theoreticians who assign them their standpoint. Critical theory is in contradiction to the formalistic concept of mind which underlies such an idea of the intelligentsia. According to this concept, there is only one truth, and the positive attributes of honesty, internal consistency, reasonableness, and striving for peace, freedom, and happiness may not be attributed in the same sense to any other theory and practice. There is likewise no theory of society, even that of the sociologists concerned with general laws, That does not contain political motivations, and the truth of these must be decided not in supposedly neutral reflection, but in personal thought and action, in concrete historical activity. Now it is disconcerting that the intellectual should represent himself in this way, as though a difficult labor of thought which he alone could accomplish were the prime requirement if men were accurately to choose between revolutionary, liberal, and fascist ends and means. The situation has not been like that for many decades. The avant-garde in the political struggle need prudence, but not academic instruction on their so-called standpoint, especially at a time when the forces of freedom in Europe are themselves disoriented and seeking to regroup themselves anew, and everything depends on nuances of position within their own movement, when indifference to substantive content created by defeat, despair, and corrupt bureaucracy threatens to overwhelm all the spontaneity, experience, and knowledge of the masses. Despite the heroic efforts of a few, a conception of the intelligentsia which claims to transcend party lines and is therefore abstract represents a view of problems that only hides the decisive questions. Mind is liberal. Mind tolerates no external coercion, no revamping of mind's results to suit the will of one or other power. But on the other hand, mind is not cut loose from the life of society. Mind does not hang suspended over society. Insofar as mind seeks autonomy or man's control over his own life, no less than over nature, mind is able to recognize this same tendency as a force operative in history. Considered in isolation, the recognition of such a tendency seems neutral. But just as mind is unable to recognize it without having first been stimulated and become concerned, neither can it make such recognition a generally accepted fact without a struggle. To that extent, mind is not liberal. Intellectual efforts which arise here and there without any conscious connection with a particular practical commitment, but vary according to the different academic or other tasks that promise success. Intellectual efforts which take now this, now that for their field of concentration, may be useful in the service of one or other historical tendency, but for all their formal correctness and what theoretical structure, however radically faulted, cannot fulfill the requirements of formal correctness, they can also hinder and lead astray the development of the mind. The abstract sociological concept of an intelligentsia which is to have missionary functions is, by its very structure, a hypostatization of specialized science. Critical theory is neither, quote, deeply rooted, end quote, like totalitarian propaganda, nor, quote, detached, end quote, like the liberalist intelligentsia. Our consideration of the various functions of traditional and critical theory brings to light the difference in their logical structure. The primary propositions of traditional theory define universal concepts under which all facts in the field in question are to be subsumed. For example, the concept of a physical process in physics or an organic process in biology. In between primary propositions and facts, there is the hierarchy of genera and species with their relations of subordination. Facts are individual cases, examples, or embodiments of classes. There are no differences due to time between the unities in the system. Electricity does not exist prior to an electrical field, nor a field prior to electricity, any more than wolf as such exists before or after particular wolves. As far as an individual knower is concerned, there may be one or other temporal sequence among such relationships, but no such sequence exists in the objects themselves. Furthermore, physics has also ceased to regard more general characteristics as causes or forces hidden in the concrete facts, and to hypostatize these logical relationships. It is only sociology that is still unclear on this point. If new classes are added to the system or other changes are introduced, this is not usually regarded as proof that the determinations made earlier are necessarily too rigid and must turn out to be inadequate, for the relationship to the object, or even the object itself, may change without losing its identity. Changes are taken rather as an indication that our earlier knowledge was deficient, or as a substitution of some aspect of an object for others. As a map, for example, may become dated because forests have been cut down, new cities built, or different borders drawn. In discursive logic, or logic of the understanding, the evolution of living beings is conceived in the same way. This person is now a child, then an adult. For such logic, this can only mean that there is an abiding, stable nucleus, quote, this person, end quote, who successively possesses the attributes of being a child and an adult. For positivism, of course, there is simply no identity. First there is a child, later there is an adult, and the two are simply distinct complexes of facts. But this view cannot come to grips with the fact that a person changes and yet is identical with himself. The critical theory of society also begins with abstract determinations. In dealing with the present era, it begins with the characterization of an economy based on exchange. The concepts Marx uses, such as commodity, value, and money, can function as genera when, for example, concrete social relations are judged to be relations of exchange, and when there is a question of the commodity character of goods. But the theory is not satisfied to relate concepts of reality by way of hypotheses. The theory begins with an outline of the mechanism by which bourgeois society, after dismantling feudal regulations, the guild system, and vassalage, did not immediately fall apart under the measure of its own anarchic principle, but managed to survive. The regulatory effects of exchange are brought out on which bourgeois economy is founded. The conception of the interaction of society and nature, which is already exercised in its influence here, as well as the idea of a unified period of society, it is its self-preservation and so on. The regulatory effects of exchange are brought out on which bourgeois economy is founded. The conception of the interaction of society and nature, which is already exercising its influence here, as well as the idea of a unified period of society, of its self-preservation and so on, spring from a radical analysis guided by concern for the future of the social process. The relation of the primary conceptual interconnections to the world of facts is not essentially a relation of classes to instances. It is because of its inner dynamism that the exchange relationship, which the theory outlines, dominates social reality. As, for example, the assimilation of food largely dominates the organic life of plants and brute beast. In critical theory, as in traditional theory, more specific elements must be introduced in order to move from fundamental structure to concrete reality. But such an intercalation of more detailed factors, for example, the existence of large money reserves, the diffusion of these in sectors of society that are still pre-capitalist, foreign trade, is not accomplished by simple deduction as in theory that has been simplified for specialized use. Instead, every step rests on knowledge of man and nature, which is stored up in the sciences and in historical experience. This is obvious, of course, for the theory of industrial technology, but in other areas, too, a detailed knowledge of how men react is applied throughout the doctrinal developments to which we have been referring. For example, the statement that under certain conditions the lowest strata of society have the most children plays an important role in explaining how the bourgeois society built on exchange necessarily leads to capitalism with its army of industrial reserves and its crises. To give the psychological reasons behind the observed fact about the lower classes is left to traditional science. Thus, the critical theory of society begins with the idea of the simple exchange of commodities and defines the ideas with the help of relatively universal concepts. It then moves further using all knowledge available and taking suitable material from the research of others as well as from specialized research. Without denying its own principles as established by the special discipline of political economy, the theory shows how an exchange economy, given the condition of men, which of course changes under the very influence of such an economy, must necessarily lead to a heightening of those social tensions which in the present historical era lead in turn to wars and revolutions. The necessity just mentioned, as well as the abstractness of the concepts, are both like and unlike the same phenomenon in traditional theory. In both types of theory, there is a strict deduction if the claim of validity for general definitions is shown to include a claim that certain factual relations will occur. For example, if you are dealing with electricity, such and such an event must occur because such and such characteristics belong to the very concept of electricity. To the extent that the critical theory of society deduces present conditions from the concept of simple exchange, it includes this kind of necessity, although it is relatively unimportant that the hypothetical form of statement be used. That is, the stress is not on the idea that wherever a society based on simple exchange prevails, capitalism must develop, although this is true. The stress is rather on the fact that the existent capitalist society, which has spread all over the world from Europe, and for which the theory is declared valid, derives from the basic relation of exchange. Even the classificatory judgment of specialized science have a fundamentally hypothetical character, and existential judgments are allowed, if at all only in certain areas, namely the descriptive and practical parts of the discipline. But the critical theory of society is in its totality the unfolding of a single existential judgment. To put it in broad terms, the theory says that the basic form of the historically given commodity economy on which modern history rests contains in itself the internal and external tensions of the modern era. It generates these tensions over and over again in an increasingly heightened form, and after a period of progress, development of human powers, and emancipation for the individual, after an enormous extension of human control over nature, the commodity economy finally hinders further development and drives humanity into a new barbarism. The individual steps within the theory are, at least in intention, as rigorous as the deductions of a specialized scientific theory. Each is an element in the building up of that comprehensive existential judgment. Particular parts of the theory can be changed into general or specific hypothetical judgments and applied after the fashion of traditional theory. For example, the idea that increasing productivity usually devalues capital. In many areas of the theory, there thus arise propositions the relation of which to reality is difficult to determine. From the fact that the representation of a unified object is true as a whole, it is possible to conclude only under special conditions the extent to which isolated parts of the representation can be validly applied, in their isolation, to isolated parts of the object. The problem that arises as soon as particular propositions of the critical theory are applied to unique or recurring events in contemporary society has to do not with the truth of the theory, but with how suitable the theory is for traditional kinds of intellectual operation with progressively extended goals. The special sciences, and especially contemporary political economics, are unable to derive practical profit from the fragmentary questions they discuss. But this incapacity is due neither to these sciences nor to critical theory alone, but to their specific role in relation to reality. Even the critical theory, which stands in opposition to other theories, derives its statements about real relationships from basic universal concepts, as we have indicated, and therefore represents the relationships as necessary. Thus, both kinds of theoretical structures are alike when it comes to logical necessity, but there is a difference as soon as we turn from logical to real necessity, the necessity involved in factual sequences. The biologist's statement that internal processes cause a plant to wither, or that certain processes in the human organism lead to its destruction, leaves untouched the question whether any influences can alter the character of these processes or change these processes totally. Even when an illness is said to be curable, The fact that the necessary curative measures are actually taken is regarded as purely extrinsic to the curability, a matter of technology and therefore non-essential as far as the theory as such is concerned. The necessity which rules society can be regarded as biological in the sense described, and the unique character of critical theory can therefore be called in question on the grounds that in biology, as in other natural sciences, particular sequences of events can be theoretically constructed just as they are in the critical theory of society. The development of society in this view would simply be a particular series of events, for the presentation of which conclusions from various other areas of research are used, just as a doctor in the course of an illness or a geologist dealing with the Earth's prehistory has to apply various other disciplines. Society here would be the individual reality which is evaluated on the basis of theories in the special sciences. However many valid analogies there may be between these different intellectual endeavors, there is nonetheless a decisive difference when it comes to the relation of subject and object, and therefore to the necessity of the event being judged. The object with which the scientific specialist deals is not affected at all by his own theory. Subject and object are kept strictly apart, even if it turns out that at a later point in time the objective event is influenced by human intervention. To science, this is just another fact. The objective occurrence is independent of the theory, and this independence of the theory is part of its necessity. The observer as such can effect no change in the object. A consciously critical attitude, however, is part of the development of society. The constructing of the course of history as the necessary product of an economic mechanism simultaneously contains both a protest against this order of things, a protest generated by the order itself, and the idea of self-determination for the human race, that is, the idea of a state of affairs in which man's actions no longer flow from a mechanism but from his own decision. The judgment passed on the necessity inherent in the previous course of events implies here a struggle to change it from a blind to a meaningful necessity. If we think of the object of the theory in separation from the theory, we falsify it and fall into quietism or conformism. Every part of the theory presupposes the critique of the existing order and the struggle against the existing order along lines determined by the theory itself. Theoreticians of knowledge who started with physics had reason, even if they were not wholly right, to condemn the confusion of cause and operation of forces, and to substitute the idea of condition or function for the idea of cause. For the kind of thinking which simply registers facts, there are always only series of phenomena, never forces and counterforces. But this, of course, says something about this kind of thinking, not about nature. If such a method is applied to society, the result is statistics and descriptive sociology, and these can be important for many purposes, even for critical theory. For traditional science, either everything is necessary or nothing is necessary, according as necessity means the independence of event from observer or the possibility of absolutely certain prediction. But to the extent that the subject does not totally isolate himself, even as a thinker, from the social struggles of which he is a part, and to the extent which he does not think of knowledge and action as distinct concepts, necessity acquires another meaning for him. If he encounters necessity which is not mastered by man, it takes shape either as that realm of nature which, despite the far-reaching conquests still to come, will never wholly vanish, or as the weakness of the society of previous ages in carrying on the struggle with nature in a consciously and purposefully organized way. Here we do have forces and counterforces, both elements in this concept of necessity. The power of nature and the weakness of society are interconnected and are based on the experienced effort of man to emancipate himself from coercion by nature and from those forms of social life and of the juridical, political, and cultural orders which have become a straitjacket for him. The struggle on two fronts, against nature and against society's weakness, is part of the effective striving for a future condition of things in which whatever man wills is also necessary, and in which the necessity of the object becomes the necessity of a rationally mastered event. The application under even the understanding of these and other concepts in the critical mode of thought demand activity and effort, an exercise of willpower in the knowing subject. The effort may be made, of course, to supply for a deficient understanding of these ideas and of how they are linked together, despite my greater attention. Oh, Jesus Christ. Where did I get despite from? The effort may be made, of course, to supply a deficient understanding. Jesus Christ. I'm going to restart the whole paragraph. The application, even the understanding of these and other concepts in the critical mode of thought, demand activity and effort, an exercise of willpower. In the knowing subject, the effort may be made, of course, to supply for a deficient understanding of these ideas and of how they are linked together, simply by greater attention to their logical implications and the elaboration of apparently more exact definitions, even of a, quote, unified language, end quote. But the effort cannot succeed. The issue is not simply one of misunderstanding, but of a real opposition of outlooks. The concept of necessity in the critical theory is itself a critical concept. It presupposes freedom, even if not yet existent freedom. But the idea of freedom as a purely interior reality, which is always there even when men are enslaved, is typical of the idealist mentality. The tendency immanent is this not wholly false, but surely distorted conception of freedom was most clearly expressed by the young Fichte. Quote, I am now fully convinced that the human will is free, and that the purpose of our existence is not to be happy, but only to deserve happiness. End quote. Fichte. Here we see the real identity underlying fundamental metaphysical polarities and schools. The claim that events are absolutely necessary means, in the last analysis, the same thing as the claim to be really free here and now, resignation in practice. The inability to grasp in thought the unity of theory and practice and the limitation of the concept of necessity to inevitable events are both due, from the viewpoint of theory of knowledge, to the Cartesian dualism of thought and being. That dualism is congenial both to nature and to bourgeois society insofar as bourgeois society resembles a natural mechanism. The idea of a theory which becomes a genuine force, consisting in the self-awareness of the subjects of a great historical revolution, is beyond the grasp of a mentality typified by such a dualism. If scholars do not merely think about such a dualism, but really take it seriously, they cannot act independently. In keeping with their own way of thinking, they can put into practice only what the closed causal system of reality determines them to do. Or they could count only as individual units in a statistic for which the individual unit really has no significance. As rational beings, they are helpless and isolated. The realization that such a state of affairs exists is indeed a step towards changing that state of affairs, but unfortunately the situation enters bourgeois awareness only in a metaphysical, ahistorical shape. In the form of a faith in the unchangeableness of the social structure, it dominates the present. Reflecting on themselves, men see themselves only as onlookers, passive participants in a mighty process which may be foreseen but not modified. Necessity for them refers not to events which man masters to his own purpose, but only to events which he anticipates as probable. Where the interconnection of willing and thinking, thought and action is admitted, as in many sectors of the most recent sociology, It is seen only as adding to that objective complexity which the observer must take into account. The thinker must relate all the theories which are proposed to the practical attitudes and social strata which they reflect. But he removes himself from the affair. He has no concern except science. The hostility to theory as such which prevails in contemporary public life is really directed against the transformative activity associated with critical thinking. Opposition starts as soon as theorists fail to limit themselves to verification and classification by means of categories which are as neutral as possible. That is, categories which are indispensable to inherited ways of life. Among the vast majority of the rule, there is the unconscious fear that theoretical thinking might show their painfully won adaptation to reality to be perverse and unnecessary. Those who profit from the status quo entertain a general suspicion of any intellectual independence. The tendency to conceive theory as the opposite of a positive outlook is so strong that even the inoffensive traditional type of theory suffers from it at times. Since the most advanced form of thought at present is the critical theory of society, and every consistent intellectual movement that cares about man converges upon it by its own inner logic, theory in general falls into disrepute. Every other kind of scientific statement which does not offer a deposit of facts in the most familiar categories, and, if possible, in the most neutral form, the mathematical, is already accused of being theoretical. This positivist attitude need not be simply hostile to progress. Although in the intensified class conflicts of recent decades, rulers have had to rely increasingly on the real apparatus of power, ideology is nonetheless still a fairly important cohesive force for holding together a social structure threatened with collapse. In the determination to look at facts alone and to surrender every kind of illusion, there still lurks, even today, something like a reaction against the alliance of metaphysics and oppression. It would be a mistake, however, not to see the essential distinction between the empiricist Enlightenment of the 18th century and that of today. In the 18th century, a new society had already been developed within the framework of the old. The task now was to free an already existent bourgeois economy from that bourgeois economy's feudal limitations and let that economy operate freely. Bourgeois scientific thought, too, needed fundamentally only to shake off the old dogmatic chains in order to progress along a path it had already mapped out. Today, on the contrary, in the transition from the present form of society to a future one, mankind will for the first time be a conscious subject and actively determine its own way of life. There is still need of a conscious reconstruction of economic relationships. Indiscriminate hostility to theory, therefore, is a hindrance today. Unless there is continued theoretical effort in the interest of a rationally organized future society to shed critical light on present-day society and to interpret present-day society in the light of traditional theories, elaborated in the special sciences, the ground is taken from under the hope of radically improving human existence. The demand, therefore, for a positive outlook and for acceptance of a subordinate position threatens, even in progressive sectors of society, to overwhelm any openness to theory. The issue, however, is not simply the theory of emancipation, it is the practice of emancipation as well. The individual parts of a theory which attempts to deduce the complicated reality of liberal capitalism and ultimately of the capitalism of the huge combines from the model of a simple commodity economy cannot be as indifferent to the time element as the steps in a deductive system of classification are. Within the hierarchic systems of organisms, the digestive function, so important for men too, finds its pure expression, as it were, in the class of the aschelminths. Similarly, there are historical forms of society which show, at least approximately, a simple commodity economy. As we indicated above, the conceptual development is, if not parallel, at least in verifiable relation to the historical development. But the essential relatedness of theory to time does not reside in the correspondence between individual parts of the conceptual construction and successive periods of history. That is, a view on which Hegel's phenomenology of mind and logic and Marx's Capital, examples of the same method, are in agreement. It consists rather in the continuous alteration of the theoretician's existential judgment on society. For this judgment is conditioned by its conscious relation to the historical practice of society. This kind of alteration has nothing to do with the principle by which modern metaphysics and philosophy of religion have rejected every consistently developed theoretical structure. Any specific theoretical content must be constantly and, quote, radically questioned, end quote, and the thinker must be constantly beginning anew. Critical theory does not have one doctrinal substance today, another tomorrow. The changes in critical theory do not mean a shift to a wholly new outlook as long as the age itself does not radically change. The stability of the theory is due to the fact that amid all change in society, the basic economic structure, the class relationship in its simplest form, and therefore the idea of the supersession of these two remain identical. The decisive substantive elements in the theory are conditioned by these unchanging factors, and they themselves therefore cannot change until there has been a historical transformation of society. On the other hand, however, history does not stand still until such a point of transformation has been reached. The historical development of the conflicts in which the critical theory is involved leads to a reassignment of degrees of relative importance to individual elements of the theory, forces further concretizations, and determines which results of specialized science are to be significant for critical theory and practice at any given time. In order to explain more fully what is meant, we shall use the concept of the social class which disposes of the means of production. In the liberalist period, economic predominance was in great measure connected with legal ownership of the means of production. The large class of private property owners exercised leadership in the society, and the whole culture of the age bears the impress of this fact. Industry was still broken up into a large number of independent enterprises which were small by modern standards. The directors of factories, as was suitable for this stage of technological development, were either one or more of the owners of their direct appointees. Once, however, the development of technology in the last century had led to a rapidly increasing concentration and centralization of capital. The legal owners were largely excluded from the management of the huge combines which absorbed their small factories, and management became something quite distinct from ownership before the law. Industrial magnates, the leaders of the economy, came into being. In many cases, these managers were initially the major owners of the concerns. Today, however, such ownership has become unimportant, and there are now some powerful managers who dominate whole sectors of industry while owning a steadily decreasing part of the businesses they direct. This economic process brings with it a change in the way the political and legal apparatus functions, as well as in ideologies. Without the juridical definition of ownership being changed at all, owners become increasingly powerless before the directors and their staffs. In a lawsuit, which owners might bring against managers in the course of a difference of views, the managers' direct control of the means with which these huge enterprises have at their disposal gives them such an advantage that a victory of their opponents is for the most part hardly possible. The influence of management, which may initially be exercised only over lower juridical and administrative authorities, finally extends to the higher ones, and ultimately to the state and its power apparatus. Once the legal owners are cut off from the real productive processes and lose their influence, their horizon narrows. They become increasingly unfitted for important social positions and finally share which they still have, and finally the share which they still have in industry due to ownership and which they have done nothing to augment, comes to seem socially useless and morally dubious. These and other changes are accompanied by the rise of ideologies centering on the great personality and the distinction between productive and parasitic capitalists. The idea of a right with a fixed content and independent of society at large loses its importance. The very same sector of society which brutally maintains its private power to dispose of the means of production, and this power is at the heart of the prevailing social order, sponsors political doctrines which claim that unproductive property and parasitic incomes must disappear. The circle of really powerful men grows narrower, but the possibility increases of deliberately constructing ideologies, of establishing a double standard of truth, knowledge for insiders, a cooked-up story for the people, and of cynicism about truth and thought generally. The end result of the process is a society dominated no longer by independent owners, but by cliques of industrial and political leaders. Such changes do not leave the structure of the critical theory untouched. It does not, indeed, fall victim to the illusion that property and profit no longer play a key role, an illusion carefully fostered in the social sciences. On the one hand, even earlier it had regarded juridical relations not as the substance, but as the surface of what was really going on in society. It knows that the disposition of men and things remains in the hands of a particular social group, which is in competition with other economic power groups, less so at home, but all the more fiercely at the international level. Profit continues to come from the same social sources and must in the last analysis be increased by the same means as before. On the other hand, in the judgment of the critical theorists, the loss of all rights with a determined content, a loss conditioned by the concentration of economic power and given its fullest form in the authoritarian state, has brought with it the disappearance not only of an ideology, but also of a cultural factor which has a positive value and not simply a negative value. When the theory takes into account these changes in the inner structure of the entrepreneurial class, it leads to different others. It is led to differentiate others of its concepts as well. The dependence of culture on social relationships must change as the social relationships change. Even in details, if society indeed be a single whole, even in the liberalist period, political and moral interpretations of individuals could be derived from their economic situation. Admiration for nobility of character, fidelity to one's word, independence of judgment, and so forth, are traits of a society of relatively independent economic subjects who enter into contractual relationships with each other. But this cultural dependence was in good measure psychologically mediated, and morality itself acquired a kind of stability because of its function in the individual. The truth that dependence on the economy thoroughly pervades even this morality was brought home when, in the recent threat to the economic position of the liberalist bourgeoisie, the attitude of freedom and independence began to disintegrate. Under the conditions of monopolistic capitalism, however, even such a relative individual independence is a thing of the past. The individual no longer has any ideas of his own. The essence of mass belief, in which one really believes, is an immediate product of the ruling economic and political bureaucracies. And its disciples secretly follow their own atomistic and therefore untrue interests. They act as mere functions of the economic machine. The concept of the dependence of the culture on the economic has thus the concept. Was it a real fart? Was it a mouth fart? You don't know. The concept of the dependence of the cultural on the economic has thus changed. With the destruction of the classically typical individual, the concept has, as it were, become more materialistic in the popular sense of the term than before. The explanation of social phenomenon has become simpler yet also more complicated. Simpler because economic factors more directly and consciously determine men, and because the solidity and relative capacity for resistance of the cultural spheres are disappearing. More complicated because the economic dynamism which has been set in motion and in relation to which most individuals have been reduced to simple means quickly brings ever new visions and portents. Even advanced sectors of society are discouraged and gripped by the general sense of helplessness. The permanency of truth, too, is connected with the constellations of reality. In the 18th century, truth had on its side a bourgeoisie that was already economically developed. But under the conditions of later capitalism and the impotence of the workers before the authoritarian state's apparatus of oppression, truth has sought refuge among small groups of admirable men, but these have been decimated by terrorism and have little time for refining the theory. Charlatans profit by this situation, and the general intellectual level of the great masses is rapidly declining. What has been said is intended to show that the continuous change of social relationships, due immediately to economic developments and finding its most direct expression in the formation of the ruling class, does not affect only some areas of the culture. It also affects the way in which the culture depends on the economy, and thus the key ideas in the whole conception. This influence of social development on the structure of the theory is part of the theory's doctrinal content. Thus, new contents are not just mechanically added to already existent parts, since the theory is a unified whole which has its proper meaning only in relation to the contemporary situation. The theory as a whole was caught up in an evolution. The evolution does not change the theory's foundations, of course, any more than recent changes essentially alter the object which the theory reflects, namely contemporary society. Yet even the apparently more remote concepts of the theory are drawn into the evolution. The logical difficulties which understanding meets in every thought that attempts to reflect a living totality are due chiefly to this fact. If we take individual concepts and judgments out of their context in the theory and compare them with concepts and judgments from an earlier version of the theory, contradictions arise. This is true whether we think of the historical developmental stages through which the theory passes or the logical steps within the theory itself. Amid all the abiding identity of the concepts of enterprise and entrepreneur, there is nonetheless distinction according as the concepts are taken from the presentation of the earlier form of bourgeois economy, or from the presentation of developed capitalism, and according as they are taken from the 19th century critique of political economy, which has the liberalist manufacturer in view, or from the 20th century critique which envisages the monopolist. The representation of the entrepreneur, like the entrepreneur himself, passes through an evolution. The contradictions which arise when parts of the theory are taken as independent entities are thus not due to errors or to neglect of clear definitions. They are due to the fact that the theory has a historically changing object, which, however, remains identical amid all the changes. The theory is not a storehouse of hypotheses on the course of particular events in society. It constructs a developing picture of society as a whole, an existential judgment with a historical dimension. What the bourgeois entrepreneur, even the bourgeois man, is such how it was. The fact, for example, that his character showed him not only rationalist traits, but also an element of that irrationalism which presently prevails in middle-class mass movements, depends on the original economic situation of the bourgeoisie. The basic concepts of the theory capture this reality, But those economic origins manifest themselves so clearly only in the conflicts of the present day. The reason for this is not that the bourgeois is understanding change at the present time, but that in connection with present-day change, the interest and attention of the theoretician lead him to accentuate new aspects of this object. It may be of systematic interest and not entirely useless to classify and juxtapose the various kinds of dependency, commodity, class, entrepreneur, and so forth, as they occur in the logical and historical phases of the theory, but the sense of these concepts ultimately becomes clear only when we grasp the whole conceptual structure with its demands for adaptation to ever new situations. Consequently, such systems of classes and subclasses, of definitions and specifications of concepts, which are extracted from the critical theory, do not have even the value of the conceptual inventories found in other specialized science, for the latter are at least applied in the relatively uniform practice of daily life. To transform the critical theory of society into a sociology is on the whole an undertaking beset with serious difficulties. The question we have been touching on concerning the relation between thought and time has, it must be admitted, a special difficulty connected with it. The objection is urged that it is impossible to speak in any strict sense of changes in a theory properly so called. The claim that such changes occur presupposes rather a theory that only glosses over the difficulty. No one can turn himself into a different subject than what he is at this historical moment. To speak of the constancy or changeableness of truth is strictly meaningful only in a polemical context. That is, one would be opposing the idea of an absolute supra-historical subject or the possibility of exchanging subjects, as though a person could remove himself from his present historical juncture and truly insert himself into any other he wishes. How far this last is in fact possible or impossible is not our concern here. In any event, the critical theory is indeed incompatible with the idealist belief that any theory is independent of men and even has a growth of that theory's own. Documents have a history, but a theory does not have its vicissitudes. The claim, then, that certain elements have been added to it and that it must adapt itself to new situations in the future without changing its essential content is rather an integral part of the theory as it exists today and seeks to affect practice. Those who have the theory in their heads have it there in its totality and act according to that totality. The continuous progress of a truth that is independent of the thinking subject, or a trust in the advance of science, can refer in the proper and strict sense only to that function of knowledge which will continue to be necessary even in a future society, namely the mastering of nature. This knowledge, too, admittedly belongs to the existent social totality. Here, however, the presupposition of claims that this knowledge lasts or changes, namely the continuance of economic production and reproduction in familiar forms, really has, in a certain way, the same meaning as the claim that the subjects of knowledge are interchangeable. The fact that class society is divided does not render illusory in this context the equivalence of human subjects. Knowledge in this instance is itself a thing which one generation passes on to another generation. To the extent that men must live, they need it. In this respect, too, then, the traditional scientist can be reassured. The idea of a transformed society, however, does not have the advantage of widespread acceptance, as long as the idea has not yet had its real possibility tested. To strive for a state of affairs in which there will be no exploitation or oppression, in which an all-embracing subject, namely self-aware mankind, exists, and in which it is possible to speak of a unified theoretical creation and a thinking that transcends individuals, to strive for all this is not yet to bring it to pass. The transmission of the critical theory in its strictest possible form is, of course, a condition of its historical success. But the transmission will not take place via solidly established practice and fixed ways of acting, but via concern for social transformation. Such a concern will necessarily be aroused ever anew by prevailing injustice, but it must be shaped and guided by the theory itself, and in turn react upon the theory. The circle of transmitters of this tradition is neither limited nor renewed by organic or sociological laws. It is constituted and maintained not by biological or testamentary inheritance, but by a knowledge which brings its own obligations with it. And even this knowledge guarantees only a contemporary, not a future community of transmitters. The theory may be stamped with the approval of every logical criterion, but to the end of the age it will lack the seal of approval which victory brings. Until then, too, the struggle will continue to grasp it aright and apply it. A version of it which has the propaganda apparatus and a majority on its side is not, therefore, the better one. In the general historical upheaval, the truth may reside with numerically small groups of men. History teaches us that such groups, hardly noticed even by those opposed to the status quo, outlawed but imperturbable, may at this decisive moment become the leaders because of their deeper insight. Today, when the whole weight of the existing state of affairs is pushing mankind towards the surrender of all culture and relapse into darkest barbarism, the circle of solidarity is narrow enough. The opponents, the masters of this age of decline, possess indeed neither fidelity nor solidarity. Such concepts, on the contrary, are elements of the right theory and practice. Cut loose from such theory and practice, these concepts change their meaning, as do all parts of a living whole. It is true, of course, that in a gang of thieves, for example, positive traits of human community can make their appearance. But this very possibility points to a deficiency in the larger community within which the gang exists. In an unjust society, criminals are not necessarily inferior as human beings, whereas in a fully just society, they would be unhuman. Only in a context can particular judgments about what is human acquire their correct meaning. There are no general criteria for judging the critical theory as a whole, for it is always based on the recurrence of events and thus on a self-reproducing totality. Nor is there a social class by whose acceptance of the theory one could be guided. It is possible for the consciousness of every social stratum today to be limited and corrupted by ideology, however much for its circumstances it may be bent on truth. For all its insight into the individual steps in social change, and for all the agreement of its elements with the most advanced traditional theories, the critical theory has no specific influence on its side, except concern for the abolition of social injustice. This negative formulation, if we wish to express it abstractly, is the materialist content of the idealist concept of reason. In a historical period like the present, true theory is more critical than affirmative, just as the society that corresponds to it cannot be called, quote, productive, end quote. The future of humanity depends on the existence today of the critical attitude, which of course contains within that critical attitude elements from traditional theories and from our declining culture generally. Mankind has already been abandoned by a science which, in its imaginary self-sufficiency, thinks of the shaping of practice, which it serves and to which it belongs, simply as something lying outside its borders, and is content with this separation of thought and action. Yet the characteristic mark of the thinker's activity is to determine for itself what it is to accomplish and serve, and this not in fragmentary fashion, but totally. Its own nature, therefore, turns it toward a changing of history and the establishment of justice among men. Behind the loud calls for, quote, social spirit, end quote, national community, end quote, the opposition between individual and society grows ever greater. The self-definition of science grows ever more abstract. But conformism in thought and the insistence that thinking is a fixed vocation, a self-enclosed realm within society as a whole, betrays the very essence of thought. Translated by Matthew J. O'Connell.